Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Fiber Broadband Association's Fiber for Breakfast. We're now in our 13th episode of 2024. Before we kick off, I'd like to thank Wesco, the platinum sponsor of Fiber for Breakfast. In Washington, D.C. yesterday, all Democratic members of the House Communications Technology Subcommittee sent a letter to NTIA urging the agency to prioritize affordability as it manages its $42.5 billion broadband expansion program. You know, the ACP program is set to conclude in April, and to date, Congress has not shown any indication that additional funds will be allocated for this program. You know, last week, the Senate Commerce Committee held a hearing on spectrum, and many of the members used this forum to raise the importance of a need to find continued funding for ACP. You know, NTIA announced a new tool for assessing the environmental and permitting requirements of potential broadband infrastructure deployment. This is intended for broadband providers to get a sense of the permitting requirements and environmental considerations for building in certain areas. You know, the Fiber Broadband Association's next regional Fiber Connect workshop will be held in Little Rock, Arkansas on Tuesday, April 16th. The registration for Little Rock is on pace to be our largest regional event ever. You know, Raleigh was a home run. We just had Richmond, that was set of records, but this is going even above all those other. So please sign up today before it's sold out. You're not going to want to miss that. In addition to Little Rock, we'll be in Deer Valley, the Park City on June 4th, Des Moines on September 10th, and then we added Calgary, so we're going to be in Canada on October 8th. So don't want to miss that one. Albuquerque, November 7th, and then of course the granddaddy, the Fiber Connect 2024 conference will be in Nashville, July 28th to 31st. So registration has opened for Nashville, so please start registering. That brings us to today's Fiber for Breakfast session with the Fiber Broadband Association's research partner, Mike Render, the CEO of RVA, who will be discussing what $150 billion in 5 years U.S. fiber to home construction means to you. But before I formally introduce today's guests, I'd like to introduce David Norris from our team, who's going to walk us through some housekeeping items.
Thank you very much, Gary, and good morning to everyone who has joined us. Before I go over a couple of logistics, I'd just like to once again thank our platinum sponsor, Fiber for Breakfast, Wesco. Now, if you would please keep in mind, all participants are in listen-only mode today. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located within the control panel on the side of your screen. We will host a Q&A session with our panelists at the end of today's session. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on FBA's website within 24 to 48 hours. You can find the recording in the Events tab under the Fiber for Breakfast drop-down option. At the conclusion of the presentation, you'll be prompted to complete a brief feedback survey. Please take a moment to do so. We really appreciate the feedback. And with that, I will pass things back over to Gary to get us started. Thanks. Gary?
Thanks, David. Good morning. I'm Gary Bolton, the President and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association. Last week on Fiber for Breakfast, our guest was Corlette Hannon, the Director for Livable Communities at AARP, who discussed AARP's advocacy for the affordable broadband in life after ACP. You know, 10 million of the 23 million Americans currently enrolled in ACP are over the age of 50. So if you missed it, you can go to the FBA website and watch the replay. In today's Fiber for Breakfast session, we're with the Fiber Broadband Association's research partner, Mike Render, the CEO of RVA, who's going to be discussing what $150 billion in 5-year U.S. fiber to home construction means to you. Mike is a recognized expert in North American fiber broadband rollout and a regular presenter at national and international broadband and smart city conferences, as well as a consultant in numerous public and private organizations in the fiber optic industry. The Fiber Broadband Associations, broadband communities, and many others rely on Mike's research. RVA, a nationally and internationally known firm for its 30 years of history of service to a wide range of organizations, and recently expanded research into growing fields of 5G and smart city technology deployment. Mike has received numerous industry awards for his work in the broadband arena and for RVA's research influence on FCC policy, and is a Broadband Communities Cornerstone Award recipient. So welcome, Mike, and for our audience, please type in your questions as we go. So let's jump in.
Very good. Very good. Well, I'd like to talk today a bit about the record-breaking forecast that we have for this coming period, which is pretty exciting. Next slide, please. And so first of all, very briefly, some of you have seen these slides before, but where have we been? The next slide will show us just how much in annual builds. You can see the upward trend, which has been very exciting. Obviously, some ups and downs for various reasons, but 9 million last year, 6 million unique homes, so record setting there by itself. Next slide. And on the other hand, as good as last year was, it was kind of a tough time for some of those in the audience that were vendors and manufacturers who, because of a kind of a inventory glut that developed in 2022, people were concerned about material supplies and various things. Too much inventory actually went out. So manufacturers had kind of a tough year in 2023 as the inventory levels were being corrected. But hopefully that will start to be turning around. We're hearing some signs of that fairly soon for the manufacturing sector. Next slide. So where are we going from here? Next slide. This is obviously a forecast that we're going to be presenting. Based on many things, we're really looking at the unprecedented capital that's available from many sources. First of all, we've got the government sources, which everyone knows about. It's not only BEAD, it's also all the other programs where we've gone back and tracked our estimate of when those actually will be going to providers, and that goes up every year for the next few years, in addition to the BEAD being layered on top of that. We've got record inventory or money from private equity companies who are realizing how important this is now, and how secure and good investment it is. And then, of course, you've got companies reinvesting their own capital into construction. So all this makes for a rather spectacular period in the next 5 years. We've reduced this somewhat because of various constraints that we'll talk about, especially in the latter portion of the section. No one knows exactly when these constraints will hit, but they are a bit of a concern. Next slide. Now, actually, let's go back one slide. And in terms of homes passed, you can see that we've gone from these are 5-year periods, 36 million homes passed, including second passings. In other words, some homes have more than one fiber provider now. But we've gone from 36 million to a forecast of 59 million. So a pretty big increase, obviously by far the biggest of any period we've had. And if you go to the next slide, you can look at in terms of route miles of fiber, and this is for all purposes, not just fiber to the home, but fiber to the small cell, long haul, all the other businesses, everything else that's involved that we try to track. And you can see the difference, the delta is even bigger. A lot of that is because the fiber to the home builds are not only more homes passed, but the distance between homes increases quite a bit as the average gets more rural, primarily because of BEAD and other programs. So that puts things in perspective of just how big a jump we're potentially looking for, even after the constraints. And obviously, no one knows exactly where those constraints will plug in, but we have some concerns about various things that we'll talk about coming up. So let's go to the next slide. And again, what are the headwinds? If we look at the next slide, we can see this is from a survey of over almost 300 providers last year. These are mostly small providers, mid-sized providers, not including the public companies and so forth. But what are their concerns? And these were ratings of 4 or 5 on a scale of 1 to 5. Workforce came to the very top of the list. Rising costs was number 2. Process constraints, particularly approvals and access, permitting, those kinds of things. Material shortages, even though that has been alleviated by a large extent, there's still some concerns there for particular products. Or one thing I'm concerned a bit about is what I might call a bungee cord effect. Is we as we drop down, all of a sudden, and people are waiting for a long time to start ordering, and then it all hits at once. Even though many of these companies have built new plants and so forth, they may not have it fully staffed and ready. So it still could be a bit of a concern, hopefully not. Locating is a concern. Weather and funding, of course, always on the list. Now, one thing I'll note, these are the top concerns. So it's not that locating, for example, isn't a big concern. It just wasn't the number 1 or 2 concern. And that's actually a concern that I've heard from quite a few people, is getting locates done timely. So there are some concerns that could slow down this, or we might say cap the annual rate of new passings. But obviously everyone is working on ways to try to work this. The FBA is working on ways to help increase the workforce, as many private providers are, and so forth. But there are some concerns about overall cap. Next slide. In terms of BEAD, this is a fairly small sample on the left, but there are some concerns from smaller providers in terms of their concerns about low-cost options, concerns about being locked into pricing with, taking the risk to do that, the need to serve all locations, paperwork, and so forth. So some of those concerns are there, and that is limiting participation somewhat on the smaller providers. On the right-hand side, we can see a survey from both years, so a good sample size there. And you can see about 30% are expecting currently to participate. And that actually goes down as you get into some very small providers, just feeling they don't have the resources to handle that. Next slide. So with all this money coming, how can you react to it? How do you organize yourself? I think one thing I'll say is that with this coming now, it's not that fiber to the home is going to be over after 5 years. It'll go on for many years after that. But this is a really peak period, and it's very important to get strategy right up front. In the past, sometimes people could make missteps and still correct. I'll give an example of Frontier, who maybe was late building fiber. Then they started buying some fiber from Verizon and so forth, and started doing their own, but had some missteps in the way customers were handled. They've really been working on correcting, and maybe are now getting in themselves a position of one of the best in terms of customer service and so forth. So there was time to correct from errors. There won't be as much time in this coming period, so it's very important to get information, set strategies going into this period, I would think. Next slide. So vendors and manufacturers. Obviously, there's many things to do, but one thing is to get a great overview of the market. Many sources from this. Obviously, we have a report as well, which we think we're very proud of, and many people have bought for many years. But there are other sources as well. Look at not only the forecast, but some of the details of who's buying, when are they buying, why are they buying, all those kinds of things to try to help set your strategy. Feedback from your own customers are very important as well. Doing surveys of your customer base to understand, why they're buying your product and what differentiates yourself. Secondly, really try to build your customer base going into this. What is your value proposition if you're a vendor? What sets you apart? What makes you different? Are you a primary provider? What can you offer that others can't? If you're kind of a secondary provider, why is that important to have more than one provider? What is your particular value proposition? Consider new target markets. One thing we're seeing is that the mix of providers has been changing over time. At one time, of course, the tier one telcos were by far the biggest. They're still the biggest and very important, but over time, their share of the market has been dropping off, and we're seeing cable companies, rural electric companies, competitive providers, some of the smaller ones now getting mid-size, and mid-size getting bigger. And so there's a really understand the base and where you should be be putting your effort. If there's any way, try to figure out ways to smooth out that possible bungee cord effect, the boom bust boom cycle. How can you create incentives for early purchases, not over purchases, but getting some inventory back in, and planning estimates from your customers, trying to understand what they might be thinking about, those kinds of things. Next slide. Private financiers, all these private equity companies coming into the market, again, understanding the market, getting customer feedback, looking perhaps the smaller providers and consortiums. We've heard there's just a record increase in people that are willing to for example, securitize based on existing customer base, as much as 7 million, I think it is, per, or 7,000, I can't remember the number, but a big number per 7,000, I guess it was, per homes passed. So, they're really feeling that this is a very secure and important market. And, that group might look at going further into smaller players and consortiums of smaller players, which would also help with applying for BEAD and so forth. Look at other markets, beyond just fiber to the home. I'm sure they are, but the long haul and mid haul with AI coming on, and the fact that we've been putting more and more data over long haul for a long time, but we might be reaching the end of the number of streams we can put on these long haul, different frequencies on these long haul routes. Shannon's law that says there's some limit. That's going to mean a lot of need for new mid haul, long haul fiber. Small cells, it's been slow coming, but it is emerging. The actual 5G small cells coming on board. It takes fiber, of course. Emerging fiber markets, quantum, fiber to the room, fiber sensing, many other things. Next slide. Public financiers, again, the information. I would seriously, got one more chance to look at requirements. I know changes have been made, some concessions related to the bonding and so forth, but I think it seriously considers more look and more research into particularly how the small providers are reacting to this, and try to, I think it's important to meet the goal the BEAD had of trying to get a good mix of smaller providers and larger providers. So just my thought. Obviously, I don't know everything going into it, but it is kind of a final chance to take a look at all that. Improve marketing to smaller providers and try to help find ways to assist them in the process as much as possible. Providers that just don't have the same number of lawyers and accountants as larger firms do. Next slide. And finally, service providers. Again, understanding your market, getting feedback from your customers. Try to develop strategies to engineer and permitting early. Try to figure out ways to get ahead of that game. Obviously, sometimes the time for permitting is very long, and it's going to probably get longer, especially as we get into 26 and beyond. Develop new strategies for island builds. I don't know if that's the correct term, but areas that are small pockets that haven't been filled. It's not a big build, it's just a small build to fill in. And of course, very rural builds. There's several companies that have been coming out with ways to make rural builds more efficient. Look at all those. Consider ramping up now. There's advice to hold back because of the cost of capital and so forth, but I think there's an incentive to try to move up your schedule somewhat before it gets really busy later in this 5-year period. And obviously, the first fiber provider, as we talk in our report, the total market for fiber is quite large, especially when you consider many places will have eventually 2 fiber providers. But obviously, the first provider in claims the best position. It's harder to churn from a fiber provider, especially if they're doing a reasonably good job of customer service and so forth, than some other kind of provider. So that puts you in the best position. Build more before the constraints and possibly higher costs hit. In other words, workforce could be a constraint. The cost of labor could be a constraint. And of course, try to look at arrangements and government funding, go back and take a look. Can you find a way to do BEAD or some of these other programs if you haven't already? And obviously improve labor retention and workforce marketing for labor attraction, get those strategies in place. And finally, of course, people have been talking about this quite a bit, but the ramp rate seems to be increasing, how fast you get to your first 20% take rate. But how do you do that? The overall thing is to get not only the product right, but the customer service right, get your NPS scores and net promoter scores higher, which is a way to measure satisfaction. But devise all those to try to get the fastest take rate that you can to build in your network. So I think that's the quick overview, Gary, and I'll turn it back to you for any questions.
Yeah, no, there's lots of questions, Mike. As always, great job. Let's just start with BEAD. We saw that mid-December, Louisiana got their money and off to the races, and we're expecting Virginia to come right on their heels, and crickets, right? So we're sitting there, 55 other states and territories still waiting for their approvals, and we're at the end of first quarter. How does that impact, you think, your forecast for this year?
It doesn't really impact our forecast for this year. We had already assumed a slower pace than, the first impression narratives of what it might be. Based on the past programs we've seen, it just generally there's some delays on all sides, and they're legitimate delays. But I think the pace that this has been moving on is pretty amazing in a way. But obviously, it's going to take a while. So
they were fast enough, right?
That's right.
So one of the questions came in is where does operations and maintenance fit on provider concerns?
Well, operations and maintenance is a big advantage for fiber. We've seen this more and more. The FBA did a good study. I was on a small part of that about 2-3 years ago that showed 40-50% differences in operation costs between DSL and HFC and fiber. And we've seen actual people saying that in their investor calls as well. People that have, Altice and different people moving from HFC to fiber have talked about 40 or 50% improvements in operations costs. So it is a very important factor, and that is another factor for building earlier and getting people off copper one way or the other.
All right, Mike, a lot of questions here related to provider participation. So in your past reports, you had kind of, the original days was Verizon and AT&T, and then now we're seeing a lot wider spread from municipalities and electric co-ops and the cable industry. So how do you see that going forward? Does that continue to be a wide range of participants?
It is a wide range of participants, but I think, depending on who wins the BEAD fund, applies for and wins the BEAD fundings, it'll vary somewhat. But we're seeing the larger telcos getting closer to finishing their base build. They may edge out further, but cable companies building more and more, still not announcements from the top two about overbuilding fiber, still trying to stick to DOCSIS 4. But all the other ones basically are been moving to fiber. So there's a big movement towards cable fiber. There's a big movement to competitive fiber. A lot of people are trying to get into places earlier. It's, you got the big ones like Google that do a great job, and then you've got many smaller ones that are maybe building 100,000 per year now with private equity funding. So there's a big emphasis there. Of course, rural electrics have been the strongest, fastest growing segment. We'll see how they do in this government funding round. That's tougher for them being smaller, but they'll continue to grow. So I think it's definitely a new game from the way it started in 2004.
All right, with all the different providers, we see a lot of different business models. especially open access architectures. Are you seeing more of that, and what's kind of your forecast on open access?
Open access is always been there. The original models in the U.S. had some concerns because in some cases the provider of the infrastructure wasn't allowed to market, and you had a lot of very small players. So it just didn't take off to the way it did in Sweden and some of the European countries. But we're seeing some more talk of that. It remains to be seen. In some cases, they're doing a kind of a hybrid where they might have one anchor tenant to start with and then move to a fully open access network. It can work. It makes some sense, but where it goes in the U.S., I think there'll be some growth, but I'm not seeing a huge amount at this point.
Yeah, certainly. I was in Berlin last week, and open access is a huge topic, especially internationally.
Right.
I was also amazed that Europe's 70% covered with fiber now, so they are making great strides and great progress. Hey, also on your data, a lot of questions about any regional differences. So when you look at your surveys and your studies, do you look at these from a regional perspective, regionally in the U.S.?
Yeah, sometimes we have certainly in the past, especially before the new mapping came out, tried to look at where the biggest needs for fiber was, and now the mapping, although it's still not perfect, is much better at looking at that. So we haven't spent as much time with that, but we have for some individual customers sometimes when we're looking at their particular areas.
All right, here's the $150 billion question is, how much of the $150 billion has been spent so far?
Well, no, this is new spending that we're projecting for the next 5 years. So other than the first quarter of 2024, none of it basically. And obviously that 150 billion is our best forecast, but we have bridges falling yesterday. Who knows what's going to happen in the next 5 years? And who knows what's going to happen and where these constraints actually kick in. All of us are concerned about workforce. The providers are. So far, they haven't seen it to a level that's really causing a huge problem. Where does that start to happen? Nobody knows. But all that being said, our best estimate, and part of that 150 billion is the fact that it costs more to build to a rural setting than it does, when you're only talking a 75 or 50-foot lot between homes. So that de-densification is a big part of that as well.
Well, certainly no shortage of private investment on top of all this, and we still got ARPA money left. Joey's got still a few dollars left in his $10 billion capital projects fund, and so lots and lots of money coming.
And we show some charts in our report, but it actually, most of those programs, most of those haven't been spent yet. You have a 5-year window of deployment basically. So most of those other programs is still coming out, even as BEAD starts coming on top of that. So yeah, a lot of that public money hasn't been spent yet.
So the funds are committed in those cases, but not spent yet. They're still 5-year rollouts and so forth.
Well, some of them years down the road, but yeah, a lot of left to spend.
Well, next week our topic is going to be, on quantum networking, and one of the questions here is, with the rollout of quantum computing, is there a significant need for fiber to connect, quantum computing centers, in addition to the 150 billion that's being spent on fiber to the home?
Yes, yeah, we've spent most of our time in this episode talking about fiber to the home, but all the other uses do build up during this period as well. And as I mentioned, data centers themselves, not necessarily quantum, will probably be the more quantitative driver, but quantum is an interesting one as well. And there will be needs for unique networks, as you've spoken to others about, Gary, for connecting quantum computers and doing this quantum encryption, where you need to pass the encryption keys over over fiber with some unique properties, not properties in the fiber itself, but some electronics along the way and so forth. So that's one of them. Yeah, there's a fiber to the home is only one of them, the biggest, but there are many areas that are exciting for fiber in the next 5 years and beyond. So.
Well, I was excited last week in Berlin when the European Commission put such a strong emphasis on their remarks on quantum communications and how we have to build out critical infrastructure with fiber to be able to support all these things coming here quickly. So, yeah. Mike, thank you very much. I really appreciate all the work that you do for FBA and our industry. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today and look forward to getting back together next Wednesday. We're going to continue our quantum networking series with Mark Wippig, the CEO of MPW. That's an advisory firm focused on quantum technology. So some more exciting stuff on quantum next week. Anyway, and then I'll hope to see you guys Fiber Day in the Hill, April 11th. I'll also be in Puerto Rico, April 9th. So join us there for our big LATAM conference. And then, of course, we'll be in Little Rock on the 16th of April. So lots of fiber broadband stuff coming up in the next few weeks. Thanks, everyone. See you guys next week.